All right, we're live here, Chris. Good
Hey,
afternoon, good morning.
hey, David.
It's that little pivotal time for anybody on the East Coast straddling the morning and the afternoon.
Yes, yeah. The West Coasters are finishing up their first morning coffee, and well,
That's
maybe
right.
the fourth one. Who knows? But
Yeah, some folks out there start work at 6 o'clock, which is kind of crazy as they match up the Eastern time zone.
and the East Coasters are trying to grab. Hopefully, they've grabbed the bite to eat while we're chatting here.
Or they're getting ready to eat after we're done and hoping it's quick. All right, so we're talking about it's good news. We've identified the enemy, and the enemy is us. It is us. So, again, we're talking about launching disruptive products. We've talked about a number of different topics, and you'll see some of those topics weaved into this. But before I get going, remember comments, thoughts, ideas, questions. Throw them into comments. To post a chat, post a comment there at the bottom right hand side. We love it. We'll respond to it. Chris will respond to it for sure, give his thoughts and ideas and feelings. So we're really talking about that the hardest thing in business is this idea of launching disruptive tech. It's hard. You're doing something for the first time, like riding a bike for the first time, or your first day at a new job. And there's all other examples of doing something for the first time. It could be quite scary, quite uncomfortable. And as Chris talks about here, it's a true definition of VUCA in business. This idea of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's really what rolling out disruptive product is. So since we know what the enemy is and it's us, we're going to talk about the inherent risk involved in disruptive tech. So that's one thing Chris is going to talk about. The unnecessary risk we seem to constantly add. So it's going to be interesting. And some things that we can change for the better.
Yeah.
All right, Chris. What's that, Chris?
The unnecessary stuff is the stuff that we bring to the game that we probably shouldn't be.
Yes, we are. Most folks are like process. They like structure. They like boxes. They like mechanisms,
Yep.
and certainly disruptive tech deployment and selling is not a box.
No, it's not.
No box. So okay, Chris. So we can be our own. What's that?
Where do we want to start on this one?
All right, we could be our own worst enemy. We could be our own worst enemy. I get it, but what I don't get is why is it good news?
That's it. So I like that. And it's kind of I throw it in there to kind of be a little bit I don't know, controversial maybe, or a little bit, but it's actually really really good news. Because as you just reiterated, these lawsuits disruptive tech is very challenging and very complex. And we're going to actually talk about complexity a little bit more, I think, today. At least that's kind of. But the good reason is that the good news is that we're our own worst enemy. Is if there's anything that we have control over, David, it's ourselves.
Yep.
So that's why it's good news, because if we're part of the problem, that's one piece of the problem that we can solve, that we have 100% control and all these other things we talk about, the uncertainty around launching, the uncertainty around the customer, the uncertainty of how the sales cycle is going to play out once you're actually in the market versus, what you think before you go to market. There's still a lot of uncertainty, and there will be. How do you create scale? How do you create buzz around your product? All those things. There's just huge uncertainty around, and we got to kind of figure those out as we go. But the one thing we have complete control over, David, is ourselves.
All right, interesting.
This so that's why I say it's good news, because that we can change, and we can change immediately.
Yeah, the concept of self-management, self-leadership, the understanding of how you should act and react in this environment. But talk about the unknowns. I mean, the first time unknowns. I mean, what is messy about that? What causes us so much heartache there?
Well, on the unknowns around, yes.
And the first time, like this is the first time. This,
well, first of all, just fact that we're doing something for the very first time. I mean, that's when we're doing something truly disruptive. when you and I have talked about examples of this, whether it be Amazon or Netflix or Facebook, when you're literally doing something for the very first time, David, it's fraught with unknowns. So when as we're going towards launch and we build out a quote unquote launch plan, it's fraught with assumptions. I mean, it's probably more assumption based than it is factual based in the face of doing something truly disruptive.
Yeah, so you're basically building a whole plan around assumptions.
You're building a whole plan around assumptions. But one of the things that, and a great example of this is your revenue model that you build out before. I've done this myself.
All based on assumptions.
Hours and hours on building out this spreadsheet with all these assumptions. And as soon as you put it on, and I've been caught in this trap many times. As soon as you put that on paper, we actually start believing our own assumptions like they're real.
Yeah, no, it drives me crazy.
Part of putting it on paper causes this to make it feel like it's real.
I'm at the point where in that type of development, it gets me very frustrated if I have to spend a great deal of time trying to build a plan that's fully assumption based because it's not logical. And the key is that you're talking about here is the mindset. The mindset to understand that you have to learn to attack these unknowns, right? It's almost like the best skill you can have. Wouldn't you say, you comment on this, the best skill you can have is being able to accept change and adapt to it?
So it depends on in this day and age, that's probably true about anything.
But I meant also for disruptive. So if I'm going to be a renaissance
tech, it's not the best skill. It's kind of the underlying necessary skill. If you don't have it, you're going to fail because because the one thing when you're going in with a plan based on assumptions, that as soon as you start uncovering reality, you're going to have your plan's going to be changing. And if you're not ready, if you're not the type of person or in the mindset to adapt and change quickly, you'll be hanging on to your old assumptions and operating with them still in mind, and that's just a path to failure.
My poor daughter hates change, so she's at work today, and somebody new came in, and it freaked her out because she so much hates change. She hates when somebody new comes in to work with them because so that's the type of mentality which does a great deal of great work, but that's certainly not somebody who could come in and really try to go after disruptive products, disruptive products.
And you and I have talked about that a couple, if we go back to and actually it's one of the last things the last major point is having the right team and selecting the right people for those teams. If you select the wrong people, if you think about it, if you select your typical engineer and put them
it's going
on
to be a horrible situation.
Team, first of all, they'll go crazy.
Yeah.
Because of all the uncertainty and the ambiguity and the working in the gray instead of the black and white. I mean, those people go nuts in this type of environment. So if you have a team built up of that, you're not going you can function. That team's going to function very poorly. So part of it's picking the right team.
And you talked about some tools in this section, so some de-risk tools like MVP. Kind of go through what are some of the tools that you can utilize to help try to reduce some of the risk?
Well, yes. So if you think about it, early in the cycle, you've got the customer discovery work, the jobs would be done from Clay Christensen or on the product development side. That's what the MVP model is, right? Instead of building out a whole product and then going to market, build out just the minimum viable product, right, and get it out to customers and start getting real feedback from the marketplace as quickly as possible. And then if you look at then there's a whole business model strategy around the lean startup that's come up, and there's all sorts of offshoots of that have come out of the lean startup. And if you go out on the internet today, there's all sorts of people with training modules for this. The one thing you don't see, David, and you and I have talked about this, is you see sales and go-to-market strategies around SaaS products. It's
all based on repeatable processes. Every type of sales training I see is tied in the industry based on them teaching you how to use a repeatable sales process and assuming that repeatable sales process will fit your needs.
Correct. And so on the
that drives me crazy.
From a complex product like you're talking about, or a B2B product, there's the sales models really haven't shifted to this this being able to pivot and change and have flexibility amongst your teams. The management style tends to be still very top down in a lot of cases, and that's and that just doesn't work when you're launching a disruptive technology, because the nature of the disruption is that it's volatile, it's constantly changing. You've got to discover. So those type of structural type of top down type of management structures are gonna fail when you're dealing with this type of thing.
All right. So you went back. You talked about self-management and self-leadership, which is great. And on this notes I have from you on this presentation, you have, but it's why I'm in business, because we don't stop and reflect on what we could be doing better. I better make sure my mic is here closer. And that concept of self-leadership, self-management.
Yes.
One note you had at the bottom was that you're saying it's why I'm in business. So saying it's why you are in business, because we don't stop and reflect on what we could be doing better. So
correct.
In disruptive tech, how much is that reflection? How important is that? At what stages should you be reflecting? Do you have a bit of a cadence on that? Give me some of your thoughts.
So it depends. It depends on the stages. So when I wrote that note, I was thinking about is that at the outset of building a plan around disruptive technology, whether it's building a company around it, whether it's building the product, whether it's the launch strategy and the go-to-market strategy, if we haven't reflected upon the business models we're using and making sure that our principal business models are reflective of the disruption of the technology we're doing, then if we don't start from there, we're setting ourselves up for.
All right, let's help people out. Some people don't even know. How do you reflect on something? How do you go about reflecting on something? Honestly, I don't mean to be flippant about this, sir. I mean, you're saying that a lot of people don't reflect because they don't know how to reflect.
Well, that's what the whole. So that's what the whole title of the conversation we're having today came from. First part of the reflection is recognizing that we might be the problem. The problem may not be the customer, it may not be the market, it may not be the product, or if you're inside the company, it may not be marketing, it may not be the R&D, it may be us.
Okay.
So the first part of reflection, I think, and this is my biggest challenge, and it's why I say I'm in business, because people don't reflect whether the problem is themselves.
Mm-hmm. Do you set aside some time?
We have to come to grips with that, David. We have to say.
Do you set aside some time? Do you write in a notebook? Just help someone get. I mean, I know how to reflect. Like I spent a half hour before this session reflecting on an article I read about self-awareness. Man, it's an amazing article saying that self-awareness is the number one key to long-term success. So I sat down with a notebook and I started reflecting on some of the elements associated with the article about myself. But should they be using a notebook? Is there some tools, some process tools they could be using? How do you reflect?
I mean, that's a good question. It's interesting that you asked. I was thinking about that's exactly what I'm thinking. I mean, in some regards, I've early on in my career and in my personal growth, I did some coursework that trained me on how to reflect. And first part being is to be able to stop and question whether our fixed beliefs, right?
Okay, good. So number one, you're questioning your fixed beliefs. So
that's kind of a first place I'll start. Is
like a premise. Like here's three premises I have. Let's question whether those things are logical or not.
Right. Exactly. So and where do those beliefs come from? Kind of do a little bit of work. At this point in my life, I don't do too much depth into that, because knowing that I'm questioning whether my beliefs and my actions that I've used historically are appropriate here is the starting point for me to start reflecting or to start.
No, but we're here trying to teach people too. So I'm rolling over to your best customers. What your problem is, your best customers are those that went through it and failed.
Well, and that helps me it helps point out to them for them to start questioning, because I mean, if someone's never launched a disruptive product before, they don't know the challenges of it. So when you start talking to them about the challenges of it, they have no reference point. My best customers are people that have launched disruptive products before and have had the struggles, got off to a good start and then all of a sudden saw the revenue flatten out or dip. Or they went to market with a particular customer, beachhead market in mind. They quickly found out that their assumptions made that market untenable or undesirable.
So is it really ultimately that the best way to be a good person at disruption is have to face it the first time and there's 99% chance you're going to fail?
So that for a lot of people starts the reflection piece of it, right? And for me, when I'm talking to potential new clients, when I start telling them some of the challenges and how to overcome the challenges, I mean, for instance, I shared my playbook with someone recently and got some feedback from it, and she's a former CEO of a startup, and she said to me, "Man, I wish I had this when I launched my company. We had all these problems." And that's kind of, for me, the best type of potential client, because that's someone that knows the struggles. So when I start talking about the struggles and what most people haven't done at that point in time, and why people find the playbook useful, David, is they know that they struggled, they know the challenges, but they haven't stopped to slow down enough to think about what they did wrong. Or how they could have done things.
So part of reflection is slowing down and actually thinking.
That is the reflection part. Now,
I like using notebooks for it. I just like putting my notes down so I can go back. Some people probably like to type it in to some type of word processor, Google Doc, or something like that. But I guess I would say for anybody reflecting, they should have not just thoughts, but they should have things written down. On those reflections.
And you're probably right. I do a lot of writing anymore, David, and that's where I do a lot of this work.
Do you do a lot of writing? I don't believe that you do a lot of writing.
You what? You don't believe how you're being smart?
Teasing you.
I'll tell you.
I was just joking about how much you write before we went on.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is great.
For me, and this is an interesting conversation, but for me, the best reflection for me and where I have the kind of insights is when I'm exercising. When I'm
your unconscious mind. Yep, your unconscious mind has gotten a chance to work over your thought process, but at least you're aware enough to do that. See, I think this is part of the problem with this disruptive tech is we just go about it based on how we're trained, and we're not trained for this. So if we're not trained for this, then we have to be thinking much more than we're used to.
Yep.
And that's also very tiring. Thinking is not easy work.
Yeah. It is. It takes a lot of energy, and I don't know the physio science of thinking, but I know the brain uses a large portion of energy.
20% of the energy. It's 2% of the body. It takes up 20% of the energy we put into the body.
But
it's crazy.
So it is that. But I think the bigger challenge, Dave, is we get stuck on the way we think. I mean, the other thing we know about brain is they get in patterns. Our brains get in patterns, and you actually have to do creative thinking and real thought to break those patterns.
Yeah. And before we go on to the next thing, which I'm going to talk about because it ties into your notes, Anthony just spoke my truth. This is my truth, brother. I am at the point now in my age that I just can't handle it anymore. I get so angry when I'm writing a completely useless document. There are ways that you could do this with very specific high-level numbers. Like how many discovery meetings you have. What are the notes from the discovery meetings? What type of trends did you see in those discovery meetings? I'm not looking for revenue. For this first 6 months, I want to have 15 discovery meetings. I want to have 3 trends that are off those discovery meetings. Let's do something like that instead of just coming up with I can come up with anything. And there you go. It's stupid is as stupid does, right?
Yeah, but that is the nature of disruption, Dave. But it's just not the financial models that are a waste of time. It's actually the business planning we do for products.
I hear you. Yeah. I'd rather say let's have a discovery plan.
I just did a go-to-market plan for a company a couple months ago, and the go-to-market plan was only 3 months long. That's it. That's the whole plan was 3 months because I knew that was the period of time
that you're going to learn.
My first critical experiment should be complete.
And now you learn.
At which point, David, the results of those experiments is going to change everything downstream or upstream, which, into the future beyond that point. So
the mindset shift. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But my go-to-market plan was only 3 months long. That was it.
So the mindset shift that you say on page 1, number 2, is from execution to discovery.
Correct.
Talk about that.
Well, here. So let me.
I love that. I mean, it's like the very basis of what you're saying.
Let me read. I got an email today from. I got an email and I was reading it, and they were looking at how do you bring people out of big industry into an entrepreneurial startup environment. What do you look for? Who can make that transition? Most people can't. And they said the fundamental big companies already have a playbook, so they hire people to come in and execute. This is what we do. But startups, or they don't have this in there, or disruptive tech launched in big companies need to figure out their playbook, and that's hard. So look for playbook writers. So the fundamental difference they're talking, isn't that interesting? But the fundamental difference is something, and it's not just look for playbook writers.
Someone who can evolve a playbook, who can discover
it. Someone's going to evolve it. Someone's going to discover it. That's exactly right. And you and I were talking about this before.
The discovery is execution, but it's a different mindset in their execution.
Yes, discovery is it, and you.
It is execution.
This is what we were talking about earlier before we jumped on the session today, and we and I haven't talked about this, but this is a critical piece of that shift. There's a decision model called the Kinevin. You and I were talking about this, David.
Mm-hmm. I call it Cinefin.
You call it Cinevin, I call it Kinevin. I'm not sure what the correct pronunciation of it is.
Potato, tomato. Let's call the whole thing off. Keep going.
But when you're executing in this place, companies have a playbook. When they're executing a playbook, a sales playbook at scale, that's in a complicated stage of a decision system. And when you're launching a disruptive technology, it's in the kind of model, they call that complex. When you're launching a disruptive product, you're in the complex domain decision domain. Here's the difference, David, at least the way I like to explain. You might have some thoughts on this too, but in a complicated decision model, if you're going from point A to B, and say A is the launch of a product to scale, right? If you're doing that in a complicated, you can lay out the steps from launch to scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Put together the marketing playbook, get the materials ready, do the launch, all the steps. Okay. Yeah. And you can do that with the proper knowledge and proper expertise. You can lay out that plan and go from launch to scale effectively. That's in the complicated way. You can lay it out and then execute against it. Here the language I'm using, execute.
Yeah.
In a complex system, going from point A to B, you can't lay out those steps. You don't have the information. So if there's 10 steps from point A to B, you have to pick that first critical step that's assumption based
and test it
and go from step 1 to 2 until you get to that first milestone. You don't have the data to go from 2 to 3. That's a complex system. So instead of executing a 1 to 10 plan, you're figuring out, it's more of a scientific method. Okay, what's my critical assumption? What's my experiment to test that assumption? Let me go. And then what do I learn? And that lays out so it's a discovery, learning, building process instead of an execution process.
And I like to talk about it saying complicated is you kind of know what the problem is, but during the course of solving it, there's going to be a lot of disruption and adjustment. And this is where Agile as a way of working fits in very well for complicated stuff. Agile hasn't been developed to deal with complex. Like you're saying, complex is I really don't know what the problem is. I have to learn to figure out what that problem is before I can even then go learn how to solve the problem.
Yep.
And with disruptive with Agile market entry, you're teaching people a way to discover and more effectively discover where that repeatable sales process is so that you can get to that unknown problem faster.
Correct. So, and it's not just not teaching them; it's actually a framework for how to do
Yeah.
it.
Here's a little bit of real quick. Here's a little bit. Just wanted to show this user had a really interesting things to say about self-reflection and self-awareness. Because again, I think it really ties in nicely to what we're talking about here. Questioning your beliefs and talking with those in detail that are your buyers is a way more valuable than building financial models. We don't talk to our customers enough.
Yep. And everything within the agile marketing framework, it's all driven from the customer, from the customer up.
Okay, so North Star. Yeah. What's the North Star metric then?
Yeah, you and I talk, and this gets back into this complicated versus complex, David. And it's one of the things I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this one. If you have reliable revenue, if your sales scheme can drive reliable revenue over time, there's an underlying assumption that's in place that's hidden at scale, and that's that you have a repeatable sales process for them to execute against. But by having reliable revenue, right, and using revenue as a metric of success, it demonstrates that you have a repeatable process that's working. That's pretty much undistinguished when you're dealing in these organizations, that's the underlying assumption that's been validated already. That piece. Mm-hmm. When you're launching a disruptive product, that's what you don't have.
Yep.
So and you and I talked about this, and you challenged me last time we talked about this, and I've thought about it more. The true metric for launching a disruptive product is the time it takes from getting launched to scale, or getting from launch to repeatable sales.
That's the metric.
That's the underlying true metric. Now, the problem is how do you measure against that? You really can't.
The only way
if you look at the data, we know that if you use a complicated execution-based model to try to do it, you will extend that time. It'll take longer to get to scale.
Yes.
You know that,
or it will die faster because you'll have a false assumption. There's a false negative.
Correct.
What usually happens is that, like you talked about, the Fred Sanford, when you have all that product that should have sold but didn't sell.
Yep.
It's like usually what happens when you use complicated methods is that you end up with a false negative and you dump it.
Yep. Well, it could fall either way, David. Right? That product maybe never should have been built at all.
That's
right?
true too, but you still haven't defined that yet.
But I think there's millions of products sitting on shelves out there that are built that have real markets that are truly disruptive, that can shift markets, and because they haven't been introduced to the market using a complex
discovery-based model,
discovery learning mindset, or an agile market entry sales framework to do it, they're sitting on shelves out there, and they shouldn't be, because they're truly disruptive products that can be changing the world and shifting markets. I know that stuff is going out there, but getting back to your North Star, because it's a complicated decision process and sequentially you have to go through the learning process, your North Star metric is going to change over time as you progress towards scale.
Okay.
So we could look at some really broad ones of what the North Star metric early on. That's going to be making sure you have the right initial customer, the right beachhead, what I like to call market entry point, and you have the right problem you're solving for them. You could have the right beachhead entry point and be talking to a problem that they don't care about and missing market. That's what happens a lot of time with product launches, right? So the first metric is validating that you have the right customer with the right problem, right? Then the next metric would be producing reliable lead generation around the messaging, right?
Yeah.
And you should be doing.
You're going to get some type of conversion off the leads.
And early. So, and if you look at marketing lead tactics, you should go out with a lead tactic or a lead plan. You should go out with 3 experiments.
Yep.
Right? Okay, we're going to try to get this customer with this messaging through this channel. Okay, that's one experiment. Here's experiment 1. Here's experiment 2. Here's experiment. How fast can we go through those experiments? And you may find, okay, experiment 1 was good, Experiment 2 failed miserably. Experiment 3 was pretty good too, but it might need some tweaking. So, so you're, and the next metric might be that. Then there's all sorts of metrics around what your sales process is, the steps of the sales process, how much time. There's a huge one that we know is really challenging for a product launch is the time of the sales cycle.
Yeah.
Your early sales are going to take really long. How fast can you go through the learning
I have
process?
a client going through that problem right now, and it's a kind of an issue based on being an older company and launching a disruptive product and expecting the repeatable sales process to work for this disruptive product. And now they're making some headway because it's such a good product, not because they're doing it right. But now their sales cycle is slowed up, so their booking goals are off. And then there's angst, right? And angst then leads to another false negative.
Yep.
The sales team doesn't know what they're doing. It's not positioned right. I mean, it's interesting problems.
That's what I call the finger pointing stage of it, right? When you get some success and then things start struggling, okay, it's the product, it's it's our delivery team, it's the sales team, it's the marketing leads aren't, it's all becomes a pointing. And when you're in an execution mindset, David, that's you're going to get that type of behavior. It's inevitable. Yeah, if you're in a discovery mindset and you're self-reflective, you're not pointing fingers. You say, okay, what did we learn? What did we learn is working? What did we learn is not working? What's the next critical assumption that we're wrong, that may be wrong, that we need to test? It's going to either push us forward to success or pivot us in another direction. And that's a completely but that now you start talking about how do you manage through this early stage. And until you get to a repeatable process and scale, you can't start doing those type of assessments that you're talking about, where you're trying to figure out who might be right or who might be wrong.
All right. Well, we hit our time. We have two other things that we're going to talk about, which is the right team and the right leadership. Right leader and right team. But you did talk a little bit about right team and the Renaissance Rep recording that we have. But,
we have.
Any high-level thoughts on right team, right leader?
Yeah, I mean, so the things, so the four things I said were, Dave, first is that mind shift from execution to discovery. Number two is, the first is realizing where we might be the problem and doing self-reflection. Number two is that shift from execution to discovery. And then three is having the right leadership and the right leadership style. And then four is the right team. And
the leadership and the team focus on elements of discovery, iteration, people who can, then the team side, people who could go in and not be put into a box. Like probably your best team members on the selling side for disruptive tech is going to be someone who hates to be put in the box. That's what I wrote for my notes.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I wrote box, anti-box people.
But let's come back to that. Why don't we come back to that, David?
Yeah.
Another one, and we'll go a little bit deeper into the right team and the leadership style for that team. That we can have that discussion next time.
All right. Doesn't look like we have any additional questions or comments at this thought. That's the thought at this point. So with that, we leave everyone. Chris, any additional comments before we jump out?
Nope, Dave. It was a fun discussion that went way off path where we thought we were going to go today.
I'm sorry.
No, that's not your fault. It's fine.
Have a good one, folks. Thanks a lot. Bye.